Okay, so welcome back. We're going to continue in looking at this question of what is worship. In our last video, we talked about how worship is about bringing our whole beings to God in submission as living sacrifices to Him. A daily choice to submit to His authority, to His will, and to His plan. And so this brings up a very crucial distinction for us as believers. And that is that worship has much more to do with what is taking place inwardly within my heart than it has to do with anything external. And this is huge for us to understand. If we want to understand where biblical worship begins, the heartbeat of biblical worship, it begins in the heart. It begins with what is taking place inwardly, way before it has anything to do with the external or the material. And I think for us, it's important to understand this distinction for those of us who are in the Western evangelical church, because there has been a shift, I would say, within the last 30 years with regards to understanding what worship is. We live in, it's obvious, it almost seems too obvious to even state this, but we live in a consumer-driven culture where everything is about the consumer, the product. And worship can have a tendency within the church to get lost in this consumer culture. And so the big lights and camera and action aspects of worship can cloud our understanding of what the Bible is saying. And that's why it's so important for us to reference this idea of the authority of God and submitting our whole lives and understanding that worship really has to do with what's taking place inwardly within my own heart. Because within the church, we have a tendency to think that our worship, that worshiping God is coming to church on a Sunday morning, and we separate, worship is what takes place before the message or before pastor gets on stage and brings the word, spits fire, so to speak. And the reality is that is an aspect of worship, but is an overflow of the ultimate worship, which is giving Christ the prominent position in my heart and inviting Him, and actually really accepting His invitation to abide in Him and to have every moment of every day be an act of worship, even the most ordinary things. For me, I'm a young parent. My wife and I, we have two beautiful children under the age of 4. And, there's a lot of mundane, there's a lot of ordinary in our lives. And so we've had to shift our perspective to recognizing those mundane moments with small children, cleaning the house, doing the dishes, changing the diaper, these mundane moments as actual opportunities and invitations from the Lord to worship Him from the innermost parts of our being. And so we need to recognize that worship is actually a conscious decision for me to align my will with the will of God, to accept His plans and purposes, and to focus more on what's taking place inwardly than what is necessarily taking place on the outside. And we also need to be careful to not be confused with what is seemingly healthy on the outside is not always healthy on the inside. And you see this all the time within the church. Sadly, you see it with pastors that fall. Their ministries seem blessed on the outside. There's an abundance. There's, they're gifted communicators, but there's a double life. Inwardly, that worship is taking place. That worship is not taking place. That submission to God's plan is not taking place. Happens with musicians all the time. Over the past couple of years, there's been several musicians, prominent musicians, who have come out saying that they no longer believe in Jesus. And these are people that have, led stadiums of people in worship and written worship songs, but now they've left the faith, so to speak. So outwardly, there can be signs of success, but again, it goes back to this this issue that we live in a consumer culture. And so what we deem as successful, what we deem as worship, is not always worship. It's actually not always healthy. So we would see that the person on stage with the amazing voice and the lights and the smoke screen, all of that, the LED wall and the crowds and the hordes of people all singing as one. And we would deem that as, wow, that's worship. But actually, I think God cares a lot more about what your everyday life looks like, especially in the mundane when no one is watching, than he would ever care about what's happening in front of thousands of people. And so worship has much more to do with what's taking place inwardly within the heart than it has to do with anything external. I think what pleases the Lord is when I make a conscious decision to love and serve my wife, die to myself, exercise the gift of patience, the gift of the Holy Spirit and patience with my children. That is worship to the Lord. That is something that is flowing from my innermost being in submission to him, ultimately bringing glory and honor to his name and exemplifying the life of Jesus to others. So those are just a few examples of what worship looks like when it's taking place inwardly within the heart.